She found him beneath a rock slide with blood in his hair and death already reaching for him. She had no horse, no weapon, no man beside her. She had a worn suitcase, her dead mother's medical journal, and two bare hands that had never once stopped when something needed doing. She didn't know his name. She didn't know he owned half the county. She didn't know that the men who left him there were already planning to take everything he had. She just knew he was still breathing, and that was enough. If this story moves you, please subscribe to this channel and follow along until the very end. And drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see just how far this story has traveled. The train pulled out of Red Hollow Station without so much as a whistle of apology, and Eliza Whitmore stood on the platform with a suitcase in one hand and a letter in the other, watching the last railcar disappear into the shimmer of the afternoon heat. She read the letter again. She had read it so many times the fold lines had gone soft as cloth. Dear Miss Whitmore, I will meet you personally at Red Hollow Station on the afternoon of July the 14th. The ride to Carter Ridge is no more than 2 hours by horse. I look forward to beginning our new arrangement with sincerity and respect. Daniel Carter. July the 14th. That was today. That had been 3 hours ago. Eliza folded the letter carefully and tucked it back into her coat pocket. She turned and looked at the station around her. A water barrel, 2 empty benches, a hand-painted sign that said, Red Hollow, Territory of New Mexico, population 214. A station master behind a dusty window who had been watching her, with the specific expression of a man who knew something he wasn't sure he ought to say. She walked to the window. "Excuse me," she said. "I'm looking for a rider from Carter Ridge Ranch. Was there any message left for a Miss Whitmore?" The station master took off his hat and rubbed the top of his head. He was a thin man, older, with the kind of eyes that had seen enough hard years to make him careful with his words. "No message, ma'am." "Are you certain?" "I'm certain." Eliza kept her voice even. "Do you know the ranch, Carter Ridge?" "Everybody knows Carter Ridge." He said it the way people say the name of a mountain or a river, like it was geography, like it had always been there. "Daniel Carter runs it. Been running it since his father passed, going on 8 years now." "Then you know him. Is he a reliable man?" The station master looked at her for a moment, too long. "What's your business with Mr. Carter, if you don't mind my asking?" Eliza looked him straight in the eye. "I am his intended bride." The silence that followed that statement was the kind that has weight to it. The station master set his hat back on his head slowly. "Well," he said, That's something." "It is something," Eliza agreed. "It's something I traveled 4 days on a train for. Now, is there a livery in town where I might hire a wagon? Or someone who could take me out to the ranch?" "Town's 4 miles east," he said. He hesitated. "But the road goes through Iron Canyon." "I have 2 legs." "Ma'am, it'll be dark in the canyon before you're through it. And there's been trouble out that way lately. Riders. Men nobody's vouching for." "I appreciate your concern," Eliza said. "But I did not come all the way from Kansas City to sit on a bench and wait for a man who couldn't be bothered to show up." She picked up her suitcase. "Ma'am," the station master called after her, "at least take the road, not the canyon path. It's longer, but it's safer." Eliza paused. She looked back at the sky. The sun was already tilting. 4 miles was 4 miles, and she knew from the letter that Carter Ridge lay another 2 hours past town. If she took the long road, she would be walking until midnight. "How much shorter is the canyon path?" "Cuts off near 2 miles. She nodded once. "Thank you for your help." She walked toward Iron Canyon with her suitcase in her hand, her boots already raising dust, and the station master, watching her go with the expression of a man who had just watched someone make a decision he couldn't undo. The canyon was quieter than she expected. Not peaceful quiet, not the kind of quiet that comes from nothing happening. This was the tight, held-breath quiet of a place where something had recently gone wrong and hadn't finished going wrong yet. Eliza noticed the horse first. It was standing off the path, reins trailing, one foreleg lifted slightly, ears turning in two directions at once. A good animal. A well-kept animal. The kind that cost real money. Its saddle was still on, and there was blood dried dark on the left stirrup. Eliza set down her suitcase. She walked to the horse slowly, the way her mother had taught her to approach frightened things. Steady, no sudden movement, voice low and level. "Easy," she said. "Easy now. I'm not going to hurt you." The horse let her take the reins. She looked at the stirrup. She looked at the ground. The blood trail led toward the canyon wall. Eliza Whitmore had grown up in a house where her mother delivered babies and set broken bones and sat up all night with people who were dying. She had grown up understanding that blood meant somebody needed help, and that if you were the one standing there, you were the one who had to give it. She followed the trail. She found him under the rocks. Not buried. Not entirely. A section of the canyon wall had come down, a slide of loose stone and packed earth, and he had been caught at the edge of it. His left leg was pinned under a slab of rock the size of a door. His head had taken a blow that had matted his dark hair with blood above his right ear. His face was pale, in the way that meant the body was working very hard to keep someone alive, and wasn't sure it was going to manage. But his chest was moving. Eliza knelt beside him and pressed 2 fingers to his throat. His pulse was there. Thin as a thread, but there. "Hey," she said sharply. "Can you hear me?" Nothing. She shook his shoulder. "Wake up. I need you to wake up right now." His eyes didn't open, but something moved in his face. A flinch. A flicker. "That's right," she said. "You stay with me. I'm going to get this rock off your leg, and then I'm going to get you somewhere safe, and you are not going to die in this canyon. Do you understand me?" He didn't answer. She started moving rocks. It took her the better part of an hour. The big slab she couldn't move herself. It was too heavy, too flat, nothing to get her hands under. But she worked at the smaller stones piled on top of it, pulling them away one by one until the weight shifted, and she was able to wedge her suitcase, her good leather suitcase, the one her aunt had given her for the journey, under the edge of the slab and use it as a lever. The slab lifted 2 inches. She pulled his leg free. She checked the leg with her hands the way her mother had shown her, running her fingers along the bone through the fabric of his trousers, feeling for the break. It was there. The fibula, she thought, lower leg. But the skin hadn't broken through. That was something. That was more than nothing. Her hands were bleeding from the rocks by then. She didn't notice until she saw the blood on his sleeve. She sat back on her heels and looked at him. He was big, broad through the shoulders, the kind of man who worked with his body, muscle built from use rather than decoration. His clothes were good quality, not a poor man's clothes. His boots were worn at the heel, the way expensive boots get when a man wears them every day because he doesn't need to save them for Sundays. She wondered who he was. She wondered who had done this to him. Because this was not an accident. The rocks might be natural enough, might have fallen any time, but the blood on the stirrup wasn't from falling rocks. Something had struck him before he'd come off that horse, and someone had made sure he'd come off it. She began tearing strips from her petticoat for bandaging. He came around while she was wrapping his head. Not fully, not awake, not coherent. But his eyes opened to slits, and he said something that wasn't quite words yet. "You're all right," Eliza said. She kept her voice the way her mother's had always been. Calm, matter of fact, like everything was manageable if you just kept your hands busy. "You have a head wound and a broken leg. I've got the bleeding slowed. I'm going to get you onto your horse and find you somewhere to rest." His eyes focused on her with visible effort. They were gray, she noticed, pale gray, like winter sky. "Who?" he started. "My name is Eliza Whitmore. I'm passing through the canyon. I found you under a rock slide." "Eliza." He said her name like he was testing whether the word still worked. You have to go. They'll come back." "Who will come back?" His jaw tightened. "Men. Hired men." He stopped, breathed, tried again. "They pushed me off the trail, brought the rocks down behind me. They'll come back to make sure I'm—" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. "Then we need to move quickly," Eliza said. "Can you ride if I get you in the saddle?" "I can try." "That's not what I asked." Something shifted in his expression. A ghost of something that might have been amusement in a different situation. "Yes," he said. "I can ride." "There's a cabin," he said as she helped him to sit up. He went white with the pain of it, but he didn't make a sound. "Quarter-mile east. Creek runs behind it. Been empty since the Harmon family moved out. You can—" He stopped again, riding out another wave. "You can get me there." "I can get you there," Eliza agreed. It was the hardest thing she had done in a life that had not been short on hard things. He was twice her weight, and he could help with maybe a quarter of the effort of getting himself upright. She braced him against the canyon wall, got his good arm over her shoulder, and walked him to the horse, one lurching step at a time, talking the whole way. Not to comfort him exactly, but to keep him conscious, to give him something to track besides the pain. "What's your name?" she asked. A pause. "Caleb," he said. "Caleb Turner." "All right, Caleb Turner. Here's what's going to happen. I'm going to get your foot in the stirrup, and I'm going to push from below. And you are going to get yourself over that saddle if it is the last thing you do before you're allowed to pass out again. Understood?" "Understood," he said. He made it into the saddle, barely, with a sound that would have been a scream in a man less determined not to make one. Eliza gathered up her ruined suitcase and what remained of its contents, tucked her mother's medical journal under her arm, took the horse's reins, and started east. The cabin was where he said it would be. It was small, and it was bare, and it smelled of disuse. But the roof was intact, and the creek was running cold and clear, and there was a fireplace with a stack of dry wood, left by the previous family like a gift from strangers. Eliza got him inside. She got him onto the cot in the corner, got the boot off his broken leg, which was the kind of work that required her to use every technique she knew to keep from worsening the break, and set it as straight as she could with 2 straight branches from the woodpile and strips from what remained of her petticoat. She built the fire. She boiled creek water and cleaned the head wound with the last of the carbolic solution in her mother's kit. She made a poultice from wild sage she found growing at the creek's edge. Her mother had written about sage in the journal, about its use in drawing out infection, and Eliza had read that journal so many times she could recite the pages from memory. She did all of this with bleeding hands and an empty stomach, and the knowledge that the men who had done this to him might come through that door at any moment. Caleb Turner watched her from the cot with those gray eyes half open, tracking her movements with the careful attention of a man cataloging information he wasn't sure yet what to do with. "You didn't have to do any of this," he said at one point. "No," Eliza agreed. She didn't look up from grinding the sage. "I didn't." Why did you? She considered the question seriously. Because you were breathing, she said finally, and I was there. He was quiet for a while after that. Then, who are you, Eliza Whitmore? What are you doing in Iron Canyon with a suitcase and no horse? Eliza almost laughed. It would have been the first time she'd laughed in several days. I came out here to meet a man I've never seen, she said. We arranged a marriage through correspondence. He was supposed to meet me at the station this afternoon. He didn't show. He did not show. Something moved in his face again, that complicated movement she was starting to recognize as a man feeling something he wasn't going to say. What's his name? Caleb asked. This man. Daniel Carter, Eliza said. He owns a ranch called Carter Ridge. The station master said it's the largest ranch in 3 counties. The silence that followed lasted exactly long enough to mean something. You know him, Eliza said. I know of him, Caleb said carefully. Most people out here do. Is he a decent man? Caleb Turner looked at the ceiling of the empty cabin for a long moment. I suppose that depends on how you define decent, he said. I define it simply, Eliza said. Does he keep his word? He's known for it. Then something must have happened to keep him from the station. She tied the last bandage on the poultice, which means either I find my way to the ranch or I wait and see if he sends someone for me. She looked at Caleb. For now, I'm here, and so are you. And you need to sleep. Miss Whitmore. Eliza. Eliza. He said it the same way he had the first time, like he was memorizing it. The men who did this to me, they're not idle men. They won't stop looking. Then we'll deal with that when they come, she said. Right now, I'm going to make broth from what's in this kit, and you're going to drink it. And then you're going to sleep. Doctor's orders. You're a doctor? My mother was a healer. I'm what she left behind. She met his eyes. It's enough. Something in his face changed when she said that. Something settled. Like a man who had been waiting for an answer to a question he hadn't quite known he was asking. He drank the broth. He slept. The fever hit before midnight. Eliza had expected it. With a wound like that, cleaned late, in the dust of a canyon, fever was not a question of if, but when. She had the willow bark tea ready before his skin even started to burn, made from the small supply in her mother's kit and the creek water she'd kept boiling. She got it into him in the brief windows when the fever broke enough for him to swallow. She sat awake through the night, listening to him breathe. She had sat up like this before, in her mother's house, with her mother herself in those last weeks, when the illness had taken hold and there was nothing left to do but be present and refuse to look away. She knew the sound of breathing that was working too hard. She knew when it steadied and when it didn't. His steadied around 3 a.m. She let out a breath she had been holding for hours. Outside, she heard the horses, not close, somewhere on the ridge above the creek, moving slow, searching. 2 horses, maybe 3. Men looking for something. Men who didn't want to be heard, which meant they knew something was there to find. Eliza put out the lamp. She sat in the dark beside the cot, with her hand on Caleb's arm, close enough to feel his pulse, and she did not move, and she did not make a sound, and she listened to those horses work the ridge back and forth for what felt like an hour. Then they moved on. She sat in the dark for a long time after that. She thought about Kansas City, about the house she'd grown up in, small and always smelling of medicinal herbs, her mother moving through it with the quiet authority of a woman who had chosen service over comfort and never regretted it. She thought about the letter from Daniel Carter, its careful, formal language, its promise of a new life, its sincerity. She had read it 100 times, looking for the lie in it. She had never found one. She thought about the man on the cot, Caleb Turner, a wandering ranch hand, he'd said, ambushed by rustlers. She thought about his clothes, about the way he spoke, about the way he looked at her, not the way a working cowboy looked at a woman, with that particular mixture of interest and uncertainty. Something more measured, more assessing. The look of a man who was used to making judgments that mattered. She thought about the silence when she'd said Daniel Carter's name. She let the thought sit without pressing it. She had learned from her mother that sometimes the truth you needed would come in its own time, and pushing it only made it hide. Outside, dawn was beginning to gray the dark. Caleb Turner opened his eyes. "You're still here," he said. His voice was rough from the fever, but clearer than it had been. "I said I would be," Eliza said. He looked at her for a long moment. In the early gray light, his face was difficult to read. "The horses on the ridge last night," he said. "I heard them too." "You put out the lamp." "Yes. That was smart. I know." He almost smiled. It didn't quite make it all the way to his face, but it was there in his eyes. "How long have you been sitting there?" "Most of the night." "You should have slept." "You weren't stable enough." "And now?" She considered. "Your fever broke. Your color's better. Your breathing is even." She paused. "Now I'm willing to sleep for 2 hours, if you stay quiet." "I'll stay quiet," he said. "Good." She settled back in the chair she'd pulled from the corner, crossed her arms, and closed her eyes. "Eliza." "What?" "Thank you." She didn't open her eyes. "You can thank me when you're standing on 2 feet," she said. "Until then, be quiet and let me sleep." In the gray light of the early morning, in a borrowed cabin by an unknown creek, with the sound of the water running cold over the stones outside, Eliza Whitmore slept. And the man she had pulled from the rocks lay still and watched the ceiling and said nothing at all. But something had shifted in his gray eyes. Something that looked, in a man who had spent years making careful, measured decisions, very much like a man realizing that everything he thought he knew about the next chapter of his life had just changed. He had ridden to Red Hollow Station that afternoon to meet a woman he knew only from letters. A schoolteacher from Kansas City. Quiet, practical, capable, or so her correspondence suggested. A woman looking for a new life. A woman willing to take a chance on a stranger's word. He had not made it to the station. He had been pulled from his horse in Iron Canyon by men paid to ensure that Daniel Carter never made it anywhere again. And the woman from the letters. The woman he had hired no one to find. The woman he had not told a single soul about. The woman who was supposed to arrive quietly and without fanfare, so that his enemies would have no new leverage against him. That woman had found him under the rocks before his enemies could come back to finish what they'd started. She had carried him through the dark. She had fought his fever through the night. She had put out the lamp and sat in the silence and kept him safe without knowing who he was or why it mattered. And now she was asleep 3 feet away from him in a wooden chair, her dark hair coming loose from its pins, her hands wrapped in torn cloth from her own clothing, her mother's medical journal sitting open on the floor beside her, like something sacred. Daniel Carter, who had told her his name was Caleb Turner, stared at the ceiling of the empty cabin and tried to work out what a man was supposed to do when the woman he had only known through letters turned out to be the person who had saved his life. Outside, somewhere on the ridge, a hawk called once. The creek ran cold and clear over the stones. And in Red Hollow, 3 miles west, the men who had left Daniel Carter for dead were already making their next move. Eliza slept 2 hours and woke up knowing something was wrong. Not wrong with the cabin, Not wrong with the creek or the morning light coming through the gaps in the wood. Wrong with the man on the cot, who was awake and watching the door with the particular stillness of someone who had already made several decisions while she was sleeping. "You heard something," she said. He looked at her. "You wake up fast." "My mother used to say I slept like a cat, one ear always open." She stood, rolled her neck, checked his forehead with the back of her hand before he could object. The fever was down, not gone, but manageable. "What did you hear?" "Nothing yet," he said. "That's what worries me." "Explain that." "Men who are searching make noise when they're moving. When they stop moving—" He shifted on the cot, and his jaw tightened with the effort of it. "That means they've found something. Or they've settled somewhere to wait." Eliza thought about that. She thought about the ridge above the creek, and the horses she'd heard in the night, and the way they'd moved back and forth before going quiet. So they may have found the cabin and decided to watch it instead of approach it. "That's what I'd do," he said. "Then we have a problem." "We have several problems," he said. "The first one is that I can't walk." "No." "The second is that I have no weapon." Eliza went to her suitcase, or what was left of it, the leather sides scraped raw from being used as a lever in the rock slide. She opened it and rummaged through the contents with the focused efficiency of someone taking inventory. Spare dress, tin of salve, needle and thread, the medical journal, a small folding knife her aunt had slipped into the kit at the last moment with the words, "The West is not Kansas City, Eliza. Keep this close." She set the knife on the cot beside him. He looked at it, then at her. "That's a paring knife." "It's sharp," she said. Something crossed his face that in other circumstances might have been a real smile. "You're a practical woman, Eliza Whitmore." "I'm a surviving woman," she said. "There's a difference." She turned back to the suitcase. "I need to get you out of here before they decide watching is less efficient than coming down." "I can't ride hard with this leg." "I know that. I'm not suggesting hard. I'm suggesting careful and quiet, and now, before the sun gets any higher and makes it easier for anyone on that ridge to see the creek path." He was quiet for a moment, thinking. She could see him thinking. It was different from the unfocused look of a man drifting. This was deliberate, systematic, the way a man worked through a problem he'd worked through many problems before. "There's a way around the base of the ridge," he said. "Stays low. Comes out behind the eastern pasture fence of—" He stopped. "Of where?" Eliza asked. A beat too long. "Of a homestead I know, about 3 miles east. There are people there who can help." She studied him. He met her eyes without flinching. But she had learned from her mother that what a person didn't say was often the most useful information they offered. "All right," she said. "Tell me the way, and I'll get us there." Getting him back on the horse was, if anything, harder than the first time. His leg had stiffened in the night. The break was clean, but the swelling had tightened everything around it, and moving the joint at all produced a pain response that Eliza could feel through his arm, where she had her hands braced. He did not make a sound. She had stopped being surprised by that. He had the particular brand of stubbornness that she recognized in people who had spent years being the one other people depended on. The kind of stubborn that had nothing to do with ego, and everything to do with not wanting to cost anyone anything more than they were already paying. "On 3, she said. "On 3, he agreed. She counted. He made it up. White as chalk and breathing through his nose in the deliberate way of a man refusing to be beaten by his own body, but upright in the saddle with his broken leg resting free of the stirrup and his good hand gripping the saddle horn. "You're going to hold these reins and guide the horse," Eliza said. "I'm going to walk beside you and stabilize the leg if the ground gets rough. We go slow." You don't give a man many options, he said. You're not in a position to want many options, she told him. Let's go. They made it perhaps a mile before the trouble found them. It didn't come from the ridge. That was the thing she hadn't anticipated. She'd been watching the ridge, tracking the high ground, listening for movement up there. The trouble came from below, from the creek path itself, from around a bend she hadn't been able to see past. 2 riders, coming toward them at a walk, unhurried, which was worse than if they'd been running. A man who runs is reacting. A man who walks already knows. Eliza stopped. She felt Caleb's hand close on the saddle horn, hard enough that she could hear the leather creak. Keep walking, he said, low and even. Don't stop. Don't look at them directly. I see 2, she said, just as quiet. There's a 3rd behind us. Don't look. She didn't look. She kept walking, kept her hand on the horse's neck, kept her face pointed forward and her breathing steady, and counted the steps between them and the 2 riders ahead as they closed the distance with the slow patience of men who had already decided how this was going to go. The rider on the left was big, heavy-set, with a hat pulled low and a rifle across his saddle that he wasn't pointing at anyone yet, but hadn't needed to. Morning, he said. Not a greeting, a statement of position. Morning, Eliza said. The man's eyes went to Caleb, moved over him slowly, took in the bandaged head, the leg resting free of the stirrup, the pallor of a man who'd had a bad night. Your man have an accident? He said. Fell from his horse, Eliza said. We're heading to get a doctor. That right. He wasn't asking. Which doctor would that be? Closest one's in Red Hollow. Then that's where we're heading. Red Hollow's west, the man said. You're heading east. The silence after that had edges. Eliza kept her hand on the horse's neck and thought very fast. She thought about the knife in Caleb's coat pocket, which was too small to matter against 2 rifles. She thought about the 3rd rider behind them, whom she had not turned to look at, and whose position she was estimating from the direction of the shadow on the path. She thought about her mother, who had once walked through a street fight in St. Louis with a basket of bread on one arm and never changed her pace, and who had told Eliza afterward, "The trick is to be more certain than they are. Most men only push when they're not sure what you'll do." I beg your pardon, Eliza said, in the precise voice of a woman correcting a man who has made a social error. I was told by the station master at Red Hollow that the Hennessy homestead lies east of the creek path. Dr. Hennessy's wife is a trained nurse. I intend to take my husband there, and I'd be grateful if you'd let us pass. There was no Dr. Hennessy. She didn't know if there was a Hennessy homestead, but she said it the way her mother would have said it. Not as a lie, but as a fact that hadn't happened to exist yet. The 2 riders looked at each other. The one on the left looked back at Caleb. Caleb met his eyes with the flat, unrevealing expression of a man who had gone somewhere behind his face and locked the door. You got a name? The rider said to him. I do, Caleb said. A pause. Well? Harlan Webb, Caleb said. I'm a cattle buyer out of Santa Fe. My wife and I were traveling through the canyon yesterday when my horse spooked on the trail. I'd be grateful for the same courtesy you'd extend to any traveling man. The rider on the right shifted in his saddle. Something in his posture had changed. Not convinced exactly, but uncertain. Uncertainty was something to work with. We're looking for a man, the rider on the left said. Came through this canyon yesterday. Big man, dark hair, riding a gray. Haven't seen anyone, Eliza said pleasantly. She gestured at Caleb's horse, which was brown. We've had enough trouble of our own. Another long silence. Then the rider on the left made a small movement with his chin. A signal, she realized, to the man behind her, and pulled his horse to the side of the path. Safe travels, he said, not pleasantly. Thank you kindly, Eliza said. And she walked forward, one step and then another, keeping her hand on the horse's neck and her eyes on the path ahead. And she did not look back, and she did not change her pace. And she counted under her breath until the sound of the riders behind her faded around the bend. Then she breathed. "Harlan Webb," she said quietly. "First name that came to me," Caleb said. "It worked." "This time," he said. His voice had an edge she hadn't heard in it before. "They'll compare notes. When they realize there's no Harlan Webb in any cattle buyer's registry, they'll come back with more men and less patience. Then we need to move faster." "Eliza." He said her name in a way that stopped her feet. She looked up at him. His gray eyes were direct and steady, and carrying something she recognized as the weight of a decision. "There's something I need to tell you." "Tell me while we walk," she said. "We're not stopping." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "The homestead I'm taking us to. It's not a homestead." "What is it?" Another pause. "It's Carter Ridge Ranch." Eliza's feet kept walking for 3 steps on their own momentum before her mind caught up with what he'd said. She stopped. She turned and looked at him. He held her gaze without looking away, and she understood in that moment that he had been holding it carefully, deliberately, the way a man holds something he knows is fragile, since she'd said the name Daniel Carter beside the campfire the night before. "Caleb Turner," she said. "I'm sorry," he said, and he sounded it, genuinely. "My name is Daniel. Daniel Carter." The morning was very quiet around them. Eliza Whitmore stood on the creek path with her hands at her sides and looked at the man she had pulled from the rocks, whose legs she had set, whose fever she had fought through the night, and whose name she had been carrying in her coat pocket inside a folded letter for 4 days. She said nothing for a long time. "You were coming to the station," she said finally. "That's why you were in the canyon." "Yes." "They knew you were coming. They knew about the letter." "I don't know how," he said. "I told no one. But yes, they must have. They've been looking for a reason to move against me for 2 years. If they knew I was acquiring a wife, a partner, someone who would stand beside me legally on the property, it may have pushed their hand." "So they tried to kill you?" "Yes." "And now they're looking for you?" "Yes." "And your ranch is likely under threat if they believe I'm dead or incapacitated." His voice was level, but she could hear what was underneath it. "I have men there, good men. But if my enemies move on the property before I return, before I can show myself alive and able to fight, we need to get you there," Eliza said. "Eliza, you lied to me about your name," she said. "You let me believe you were a stranger when you knew who I was from the moment I told you." She paused. "We will discuss that later. Right now, your ranch is in danger, and the men looking for you are going to figure out they've been lied to within the hour." She picked up the horse's reins and began walking east again. "So we move, and you tell me everything I need to know about what I'm walking into. Every enemy, every name, every piece of land they want, and every reason they want it. Do you understand me?" He looked at her from the saddle with those gray eyes, and whatever he saw in her face made something in him ease. Not relax, not quite, but ease. Like a man setting down something he'd been carrying for a long time. "I understand you," he said. "Then start talking." He talked. He told her about Holt Brennan, who had come into Red Hollow County 3 years ago with Eastern money and a plan to acquire every significant piece of land between the canyon and the river. He told her about the railroad survey that had been done the previous year, about the route that ran directly through Carter Ridge property, about the figure that the railroad would pay, had offered to pay, for the right-of-way. Enough money to make a man like Brennan willing to do things that couldn't be taken back. He told her about the two smaller ranchers who had already sold under pressure they hadn't asked for and hadn't been able to resist. He told her about his foreman, a man named Roy Briggs, who had been with the Carter family since Daniel was 12 years old, and who was currently holding the ranch with a skeleton crew while Daniel had ridden out alone because he hadn't wanted anyone to know about the letter, about the bride, about the one personal thing he'd allowed himself in 3 years of fighting for his own land. He told her about the letters, how he had started writing them to the agency in Kansas City, because a lawyer friend had told him that a married man with a documented partner had stronger standing in certain property disputes than a single man whose estate could more easily be challenged and claimed. It had been a practical decision, a strategic decision. And then she wrote back, he said. He stopped there. Eliza kept her eyes on the path. And then I wrote back, she said. And then you wrote back, he agreed. And the letters they were not what I expected. You wrote like someone who had thought carefully about things, about land and work, and what it means to build something with another person. You wrote like someone who understood that a partnership requires honesty more than it requires sentiment. I believe that, Eliza said. I know you do. That was the problem. He paused. I started writing back honestly. More honestly than I had intended to. The path curved east. Somewhere ahead, through the morning, came the distant sound of cattle. The last letter I sent you, Daniel said. The one promising to meet you at the station. I wrote it 3 days before I intended to send it. I rewrote it twice. Eliza was quiet. I wanted to say the right thing, he said. I wasn't sure what the right thing was. You could have just told the truth, she said. I did, eventually. After I carried you through a canyon and set your broken leg. A pause. Yes, after that. She stopped walking. She turned around and looked up at him. He was watching her with that careful, measuring look she had been cataloging since the first moment he'd opened those gray eyes in the canyon. Mr. Carter, she said. Daniel, he said. Please. Daniel, she said at once, testing the weight of it. I am not angry with you for the name. I understand why you hid it. You didn't know who I was. You were injured. And telling a stranger that you're the man with the biggest target on his back in 3 counties is not the obvious first move. She held his gaze. But I need you to understand something. Tell me. I did not come out here to be a piece in someone's legal strategy, she said. I came out here because your letters made me believe you were a man worth trusting. If I was wrong about that, I need to know now, before I walk one more step toward your ranch. Daniel Carter looked at Eliza Whitmore for a long moment. You weren't wrong, he said. She read his face the way she had been taught to read a fever, not for what it was showing, but for what it was working to hold back. She saw a man who had spent 3 years being careful and strategic and alone, and who was standing at the edge of something he hadn't expected and wasn't sure yet how to navigate. She understood that. She had been standing at that edge herself. All right, she said. She turned back east. Then let's get you home. They heard the smoke before they saw the ranch. Not a cooking fire. Too thick, too dark for that. Eliza felt Daniel go rigid in the saddle above her. That's coming from the south pasture, he said. He'd gone still in the specific way of a man absorbing information his body had already understood before his mind caught up. They fired the grass. To drive the cattle? To draw my men away from the house. His voice had changed, harder, stripped down, the voice of a man shifting from injured traveler to something else entirely. If Roy pulls the crew south to handle the fire, the house is open. How far are we? Half a mile. Can you ride hard? I have to. Eliza looked up at him, She looked at the set of his jaw and the grip of his hand on the saddle horn and the white line of controlled pain around his mouth. Then she grabbed the saddle, put her foot in the stirrup below his good leg, and swung up behind him. "Then ride," she said. Daniel Carter touched his heel to the horse, and they ran. The ranch gate was standing open when they came through it. Not broken. Standing. The way a gate stands when someone has unlocked it deliberately, from the inside. Someone who was supposed to be on Daniel's side of the fence. Eliza felt him register it, felt the breath he took and didn't release. 3 men were in the yard, not Brennan's hired riders. These were Carter ranch hands. People Daniel recognized. People she could tell he recognized, from the way his posture shifted. But 2 of them were standing with the particular uncertainty of men who had received instructions from 2 different directions and weren't sure which ones to follow. The 3rd man, standing closest to the house, was Roy Briggs. He was a spare, weathered man of about 60, with the posture of someone who had never once in his life allowed himself to slump, and he turned at the sound of hoofbeats, with a rifle already in his hands. He saw Daniel. Something moved through his face that would have broken a person's heart if they'd been watching for it. The way a man looks when something he'd been quietly preparing himself to accept as lost turns out to still be alive. "Boss," he said. Just the one word, but the way he said it. "Roy." Daniel pulled the horse up and got down, badly, Eliza steadying his arm as he managed it, all the control in his body going into not falling the last foot to the ground. He stood on his good leg and looked at his foreman. "Talk to me. How bad is it?" "Bad enough." Roy was already scanning the yard, the gate, the south horizon where the smoke was rising. Brennan's men came at first light, 6 of them. Said they had a legal claim document signed by a county judge. That document is fraudulent. I know it is, but 3 of our boys didn't know that, and Brennan's lawyer talked fast. Roy's jaw tightened. Jimmy Crane opened the gate, said he was sorry about it after, said the lawyer had convinced him it was legitimate. I don't know if I believe him. Where are Brennan's men now? 2 stayed at the gate, which you rode right past. They must not have recognized you. Roy looked at Eliza with undisguised assessment. Who is she? She's the reason I'm alive, Daniel said. Her name is Eliza Whitmore. She has full standing here. Treat her accordingly. Roy looked at Eliza again. Whatever he saw in her face apparently satisfied him, because he gave a single, short nod. Ma'am. Mr. Briggs, Eliza said. How many men do you have who are certain? Certain as in loyal? Certain as in will not open any more gates. Roy almost smiled. 5, maybe 6. And Brennan has how many here? 6 at the property, and more in town from what I hear. Then we need the sheriff, Eliza said. She looked at Daniel. You said there was proof of the conspiracy. Documents. In the house, Daniel said. In the desk in my office. Letters between Brennan and the county judge, and a surveyor's report that proves the railroad document was altered. Then that's what we need to get to the sheriff before Brennan's men find it and destroy it. Roy and Daniel looked at each other with the look of 2 men who had just been handed a tactical assessment by someone they hadn't expected to provide one. She's right, Roy said. She usually is, Daniel said. Eliza was already walking toward the house. Miss Whitmore. Daniel's voice stopped her at the door. She turned. He was standing on his good leg in the yard, his foreman beside him, his ranch around him, scarred and under threat, but standing. And he looked at her with those gray eyes that had been memorizing her since the first moment they'd opened in the canyon. Thank you, he said, for all of it. You said I could thank you when I was standing on 2 feet, he added. I'm standing. Eliza looked at him for a moment. She thought about the folded letter in her coat pocket. She thought about 4 days on a train, and a man who hadn't come to the station, and a canyon full of rocks, and a night sitting in the dark holding someone's pulse in her fingertips, waiting to find out if it would still be there in the morning. "You're standing on one foot," she said. "The other one's broken." She turned back to the door. "Ask me again when the ranch is safe." She went inside to find the documents. Behind her, in the yard, she heard Roy Briggs say something quiet and low to Daniel. She didn't catch the words, but she heard Daniel's answer. "I know," he said. "I know." The desk was locked. Eliza tried the top drawer first, then the side ones, running her hands along the undersides of each for a hidden key, the way her mother had once found a neighbor's hidden cash box. Not snooping, just knowing that people who hid things tended to hide them close to where the thing was hidden. She found it taped to the bottom of the center drawer. Flat brass key, small enough to miss if you weren't looking. She unlocked the desk. The letters were there, a bundle of them, tied with brown cord, with a surveyor's report folded beneath and a second document, official-looking, county seal embossed at the top, that had 3 lines crossed out and rewritten in a different hand than the one that had signed the bottom. She knew what altered documents looked like. Her mother had once been handed a forged medical certificate by a man trying to claim a dead woman's estate, and she had shown Eliza the telltale signs, the pressure difference in the ink, the slight misalignment of rewritten letters, the way the paper surface changed where it had been scraped. This document had all 3. She took everything, rolled it together, and tucked it inside her mother's medical journal, which she pressed flat against her chest under her coat. She was back outside in 4 minutes. Daniel was still in the yard, standing on his good leg with Roy beside him and 2 ranch hands she hadn't met flanking the gate. He looked at her when she came through the door, and the question was in his face before he asked it. "I have them," she said. Something moved through him that looked like relief, but carried more weight than that, like a man who had not let himself breathe for several hours, finally deciding it was safe to. "Brennan's men at the gate," Roy said, low and urgent. "They're coming up the road. Looks like they went and got reinforcements." Eliza looked at Daniel. "How far is the sheriff?" "Red Hollow, 4 miles. 1 rider," Roy said. "Fast. I can send Pete Alderman. The boy rides like the wind, and nobody knows his face." "Send him," Daniel said. Roy barked a name, and one of the hands broke from the fence at a run for the stable. Then the gate opened, and Holt Brennan rode in. He was not what she had expected. Eliza had built a picture of Brennan from Daniel's words during their walk. A picture of a heavy, loud man, the kind of villain who announced himself. What rode through the gate instead was lean, well-dressed, with a pleasant face and the kind of easy confidence that came from never once having been told no in a setting that mattered. He had 4 riders behind him and a man in a suit at his side who had "lawyer" written in every crease of his clothing. Brennan looked at Daniel with what appeared to be genuine surprise. "Carter," he said, "you're alive." "Disappointed?" Daniel said. Brennan's pleasant expression didn't shift. That was the thing about him, Eliza saw immediately. He wore pleasantness the way other men wore armor. "I heard there was trouble in Iron Canyon yesterday. Rockslide. I was concerned." "Were you?" "Naturally." Brennan's eyes moved to Eliza with a careful assessment of a man cataloging threats. "Who's this?" "My wife," Daniel said. The word landed like a stone in still water. Eliza did not react to it. She stood beside Daniel, with the medical journal pressed against her chest and her face composed into the particular expression her mother had used when confronting men who expected women to either argue or shrink, which was neither. Brennan smiled. "I wasn't aware you were married, Carter." "There are many things you're not aware of," Daniel said, "including the fact that the document your lawyer is carrying is a forgery." The lawyer stiffened. Brennan's smile held but thinned. "That's a serious accusation." "I have the original," Daniel said, "along with the correspondence between you and Judge Harmon that explains how the revision was arranged. My writer left for the sheriff's office 10 minutes ago." The first crack appeared in Brennan's composure. Small, a tightening around the eyes, a fractional stillness that lasted half a second too long. A man recalculating. "You're bluffing," Brennan said. "I rarely bluff," Daniel said. "It's inefficient." Brennan looked at Eliza. He looked at the journal pressed to her chest. He was smart enough to put it together. "Give me the documents," he said to her, still pleasantly, the way a man says, "Pass the salt." "I beg your pardon?" Eliza said. "Whatever you're carrying, give it to me, and I'll make sure your husband's medical bills are covered, and this whole unpleasant situation disappears before the sheriff has to make the trip out here." "You're offering to bribe me," Eliza said. "I'm offering a practical resolution." Eliza looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the men in the canyon. She thought about Daniel under the rocks with blood in his hair and death reaching for him. She thought about the night she had sat in the dark, counting the seconds between his breaths, not knowing if the next one would come. "No," she said. Brennan's pleasantness finally gave way, just for a moment, a flash of the thing underneath, which was not pleasant at all. "Mrs. Carter," he said, "you don't understand what you're getting involved in." "I understand perfectly," she said. "You had my husband ambushed in a canyon and left for dead because you want his land and his railroad money. You bribed a county judge to produce a fraudulent legal claim, and when that wasn't enough, you sent armed men to his property to intimidate his workers and drive his cattle." She kept her voice even and her eyes on his. "What I'm involved in, Mr. Brennan, is the law, which you appear to have forgotten applies to men like you as well as everyone else." The yard was very quiet. Roy Briggs, standing 3 feet to her left, said nothing. But she heard him exhale. Brennan looked at her for a long time, with eyes that had stopped being pleasant entirely. Then he looked at his riders. Then he looked at Daniel. "This isn't finished," he said. "No," Daniel agreed. "It's not. But it will be." Brennan wheeled his horse and rode out through the gate, his men behind him, his lawyer scrambling to follow. The gate stood open. The next 2 hours were the kind that carved themselves into memory, whether a person wanted them to or not. Roy organized the men. Daniel, who could not ride and could barely stand, directed operations from the front step with the focused efficiency of a man who had run this ranch for 8 years and knew every variable in it. He sent 3 hands to the south fence to manage the grass fire. He sent 2 to the high ridge to watch Brennan's likely approach routes. He sent the remaining 2 to the 2 neighboring homesteads, the Alderman family and the Vasquez family, smaller operations that Brennan had been squeezing for a year, to ask if they'd be willing to stand witness. He did all of this in the voice of a man who was in considerable pain and intended not to let it matter. Eliza changed his bandages. She did it on the front step because he refused to go inside while his men were working, and she did it with the brisk efficiency she applied to everything, and they did not speak much while she worked. Then she said, "The word you used when Brennan asked who I was." Daniel was quiet for a moment. "I know." "You said, wife." "I know what I said." "We are not married." "No," he said, "we are not." She tied off the last bandage and sat back. "It was tactically sound," she said. "A married man with a documented partner has stronger legal standing. You told me that yourself on the creek path." "I did." And you also said you started writing those letters for tactical reasons, and then something changed. He looked at her steadily. I did say that. So I need to know, Eliza said, whether what you said to Brennan was strategy or something else. The sounds of the ranch moved around them. Men calling to each other, cattle distant and unsettled, the smoke from the south fading as the hands got it under control. Daniel Carter sat on the step of his own house with his broken leg out in front of him and looked at Eliza Whitmore with an expression she had not seen on him before, which was the expression of a man who had run out of careful language and was deciding whether that was a disaster or a relief. Something else, he said. She looked at him. I have not been able to stop thinking clearly since you walked up out of that canyon, he said. I want to be honest with you about that, because you asked me once if I was a man who kept his word, and I told you I was, and I intend to prove it. He paused. So, something else. Eliza was quiet for a moment. You pulled me out from under those rocks, he said. You set my leg and fought my fever and sat up all night in the dark to make sure I was still breathing. You faced down 3 armed riders on a creek path with a paring knife in my pocket and nothing but nerve and good sense in yours. And then you walked into my house and found what I needed and stood in front of Holt Brennan and told him to his face what he was. He stopped. I wrote those letters for a practical reason. I told myself that was all it was. But I've never in my life written 10 pages to a stranger and found myself staying up past midnight because I wanted to finish what I was saying. Eliza said nothing. You don't have to answer that, he said. I'm not asking you for anything right now. I'm just not going to lie to you again by pretending it was only strategy. She stood up. She brushed the dust off her skirt with both hands and looked out at the yard where his men were working. Her hands still had strips of cloth wrapped around the worst of the cuts she'd gotten in the canyon. Her dress was ruined. Her suitcase was a wreck. She had been in New Mexico territory for less than 24 hours, and she had done more living in those hours than in the previous 2 years in Kansas City combined. My mother used to say that the surest way to know a person's character, she said, was to watch what they did when things went wrong. She looked at him. Your character is not in question, she said. Now rest your leg. The sheriff will be here within the hour, and I need you coherent. She went back inside. Daniel Carter sat on the step and felt something shift in his chest. Slow and permanent, like a door that had been stuck a long time, finally deciding to open. The sheriff arrived in 50 minutes. His name was Cal Draper, a compact man in his 50s, with a deputy on either side, and the resigned expression of a man who had hoped his afternoon would be less complicated than it was turning out to be. He had ridden hard from Red Hollow, and his horse showed it, and he looked at the smoke still fading from the south pasture with the expression of a man whose afternoon had just gotten as complicated as he'd feared. He looked at Daniel. He looked at Eliza. He looked at the documents she spread on the table in the front room with the careful deliberateness of someone who had read them twice on the way to the door and knew exactly what was there. Where'd you get these? He said. Daniel's desk, Eliza said. He's kept them for the better part of a year. And this, Draper picked up the altered county document with 2 fingers. This is the claim Brennan's lawyer presented this morning? It is. Draper looked at Roy. These the same papers Brennan's man showed you at the gate? Same seal, Roy said. Different words in sections 3 and 4. I noticed it, but I didn't have the original to compare. Draper set the document down. He looked at Eliza with the assessing look of a man recalibrating who in the room he needed to take seriously. You're the one who found all this? I'm the one who knew where to look, Eliza said. Daniel showed me. She's Mrs. Carter, Daniel said from the doorway, where he'd appeared without anyone noticing, managing his bad leg against the frame with the focused effort of a man determined to be present for the next part of this conversation. Draper looked at Daniel, then at Eliza. "I wasn't aware you'd married, Carter." "Recent development," Daniel said. Eliza did not look at him, but she did not correct him either. Draper pulled out his notebook. "I'm going to need a full statement, from both of you, from Mr. Briggs, and I'm going to need to know who can place Brennan's men in Iron Canyon at the time you were ambushed." "The station master at Red Hollow," Eliza said immediately. "He saw 2 of Brennan's riders pass through the station road yesterday morning. He hesitated when I asked about Daniel. I believe he knows more than he said, and was afraid to say it." Draper wrote. "Name?" "I didn't ask his name. He's a thin man, older. He's been at that station long enough that he knew Daniel's name without hesitation when I mentioned Carter Ridge." "That's Amos Fielding," Draper said. "He's been at that station 12 years. He looked at her steadily. "You'd be willing to give formal testimony?" "I'd be willing to give formal testimony," Eliza said. "A written statement and whatever else the law requires. I watched those men almost kill my husband in a canyon yesterday, and I spent the night making sure he stayed alive. I intend to see the people responsible for that answer for it." The word husband came out as easily as any other word she had said that day, which was something she noted and set aside for later consideration. Draper looked at her for a long moment. Then he closed his notebook and stood. "I'm going to send my deputy to bring in Brennan for questioning. If these documents are what they appear to be, and if Amos Fielding confirms what you're saying about those riders, we're looking at attempted murder and fraud against a county officer." He paused. "That's a hanging matter, Mrs. Carter." "I know what it is," Eliza said. Brennan did not come quietly. He had been at his operation east of town, a sprawling set of buildings that he'd bought with money that had come from somewhere nobody had been able to trace, when the deputy arrived. By the time Draper's man reached the property, Brennan had apparently received word that something had gone wrong, because he met the deputy at the gate with 4 armed men and a refusal. The deputy rode back to Carter Ridge and reported. Daniel stood in the front room with his foreman and his sheriff and his... Eliza noted the word she kept applying to herself in relation to Daniel Carter and did not push it away, and listened to the report with his arms crossed and his jaw set. "He's going to run," Roy said. "If he thinks the documents are real and that we have them, he'll cut his losses and run before this gets to a judge." "He can't run far enough," Draper said. "Not if I telegraph the county seat tonight." "Tonight might be too late," Daniel said. "He'll move on the ranch again before he goes. He's not a man who accepts losing without costing the other person something first." Eliza had been listening. She had been thinking while she listened, which was a habit her mother had built into her early. Listen first, Eliza, then think, then speak, in that order, not the other way around. "How many men can Draper legally deputize?" she asked. Everyone in the room looked at her. "Temporarily," she said. "For tonight. If Brennan makes a move on the ranch, you need numbers, and you need legal authority. How many men?" Draper thought about it. "As many as I need in an emergency situation." "Then deputize Daniel's men, all of them. Give them legal standing to defend this property." She looked at Daniel. "The Vasquez family and the Alderman family. Did they agree to stand witness?" "They're coming at sundown," Roy said. "Ask them if they'll stand beside it too," she said. "Not just witness. Stand." Brennan has been squeezing them for a year. If he loses tonight, they're free. They have as much reason to be here as anyone. Roy looked at Daniel with the expression of a man who had been asked to evaluate a proposal and found it sound against his expectations. "She's not wrong," Roy said. "She's not wrong," Daniel agreed. He looked at Eliza across the room. The late afternoon light was failing, and someone had lit the lamp on the table, and it threw warm light across the documents and the medical journal and the faces of the men working out how to protect what was his. What was theirs, a quiet part of his mind said, and did not apologize for saying it. "All right," he said. "We do it her way." Sundown came with the Vasquez family and the Alderman family, and their combined 11 sons and farmhands arriving at the Carter Ridge gate, armed and ready, and wearing the expressions of people who had been waiting a long time for a night when fighting back was something they could do legally and openly. Miguel Vasquez, who was 45 and had 3 sons, and had watched Brennan's men drive one of his best bulls off his land 6 months ago with a fraudulent grazing claim, shook Daniel's hand at the gate, and then looked at Eliza. "Mr. Briggs says you're the one who brought the documents to the sheriff," he said. "They were Daniel's documents," Eliza said. "I just carried them." Miguel looked at her with the frank assessment of a man who had spent his life reading people accurately, because inaccuracy was expensive. "You're the mail-order bride," he said. The phrase sat in the air between them. "I'm Eliza Carter," she said. The name came out before she decided to say it. It landed on the air and stayed there, and she did not take it back. Miguel nodded slowly, like a man confirming something he'd already suspected. "Then welcome to Red Hollow, Mrs. Carter," he said. "We're glad you came." The night settled over the ranch. Brennan's men came at 10 o'clock. They came quiet, which was what Daniel had predicted. No torches, no noise. 8 riders spread across the approach to scatter the defense. They had not anticipated the Vasquez boys on the north fence. They had not anticipated Tom Alderman's 3 sons on the east pasture, deputized and waiting in the dark. They had not anticipated Eliza Whitmore, who had spent the previous hour reading her mother's journal by lamplight until she found the page she was looking for. Sage and dried bark burned together produced a smoke that was thick and low and disorienting in an enclosed approach. And the gap between the canyon wall and the north fence was an enclosed approach. And Eliza had spent 2 hours that afternoon bundling the materials she'd found in the shed and the creek bank into tight packets that would hold a flame. Roy Briggs had looked at her plan with deep skepticism. He had looked at the result with something very different. The first smoke packet went up when Brennan's lead rider was 20 yards from the north fence. The smoke rolled low and fast in the night wind, and the horses hit it before their riders could pull them back. And horses that encountered unexpected dense smoke in darkness did exactly what horses always did in those circumstances. The approach collapsed into confusion. The Vasquez boys stepped out of the dark with deputized authority and rifles they knew how to use. And the Alderman sons came up from the east, and Sheriff Draper came through the main gate with both deputies. And what had been planned as a quiet assault on a vulnerable property became something else very quickly. By midnight, 6 of Brennan's men were in custody. Brennan himself was not among them. Roy found the horse at the south fence at midnight, saddled, empty. Daniel stood with his foreman in the dark, standing on 2 legs now, the broken one splinted and taped and painful, but bearing weight by sheer determination, and looked at the empty saddle. "He ran on foot," Roy said. "Can't go far. Desert's open country past the South Ridge." "He knows these hills," Daniel said. "He's been surveying them for 2 years. So have we, and we have more men." "In the morning," Daniel said. "We'll find him in the morning." He was quiet for a moment. "Is everyone accounted for?" "Everyone." Roy looked at him sideways. "Including your wife." Daniel looked toward the house. Eliza was on the front step with Miguel Vasquez's youngest daughter, a girl of about 12, who had apparently attached herself to Eliza sometime around the smoke packets, and had not detached since. And the two of them were talking in the lamplight about something that had the girl laughing. He stood and watched for a moment. He thought about a letter written by a school teacher in Kansas City, careful and honest and thinking hard about what it meant to build something with another person. He thought about pulling his pen across paper at midnight, not because he needed to finish the letter, but because he didn't want to. He thought about a woman who had found him under the rocks and decided, without knowing anything about him, that a breathing person was worth her effort. "Roy," he said. "Boss?" "In the morning, when this is finished." He paused. "I need to talk to Eliza." Roy was quiet for a long moment. Then, "She called herself Mrs. Carter tonight," when Miguel asked. Daniel went still. "Thought you should know," Roy said. He walked back toward the fence line, leaving Daniel standing alone in the dark. The lamp on the porch threw warm light across the step where Eliza was talking to the child, her voice low and even and carrying across the quiet yard. Daniel Carter stood in the dark outside his own gate and felt the night settle around him, like something he hadn't known he'd been waiting for. Above the ridge, the stars were out in numbers you only saw in country this open and this dark. And somewhere south of the fence line, a man named Holt Brennan was running through the desert. And by morning, it would all be finished. But that was morning. Tonight, the ranch was standing. His people were safe. And on the front step of the house his father had built, the woman he had written 10 pages to at midnight was making a 12-year-old girl laugh in the lamplight. He began walking toward the step. He reached the step just as Miguel Vasquez's daughter ran off to find her father. And Eliza looked up at him with a lamp throwing warm light across her face, and the kind of tiredness in her eyes that comes not from weakness, but from a person who has given everything they had, and is only now allowing themselves to feel the weight of it. "You should be off that leg," she said. "Probably," Daniel agreed. He sat down on the step beside her, not across from her, not at a careful distance, but beside her, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched, and she did not move away. "Brennan ran. We'll find him in the morning." "I know." She had her mother's journal in her lap, closed now, her hands resting on the cover. "Is everyone all right?" "Everyone's all right." She nodded, said nothing. "Eliza." He said her name the way he always said it, like it was something he wanted to be careful with. "Miguel told me what you said tonight, at the gate." She was quiet for a moment. "I know what I said." "You don't have to." "Daniel." She turned and looked at him directly, the way she had looked at Holt Brennan that afternoon. No softening, no hedging, just the straight, clear line of a woman saying exactly what she meant. "I know what I said, and I said it because I chose to." Not because I was confused about the situation, or caught off guard. I said it because standing in front of your neighbors and calling myself anything else felt like a lie. And I have enough experience with lies in the last 2 days to last me some time. He looked at her. "However," she said, "I want to be clear that choosing a name and agreeing to a situation are 2 different things, and I will not be managed into a decision. If and when I decide what I want, I will tell you plainly." "I would expect nothing less," he said. She looked at him for a moment longer. Then she looked back out at the yard, where the men were settling, some sleeping against the fence, some keeping watch by the gate. The whole scene carrying the particular exhausted peace of people who had fought hard and come through it. "You wrote in your 3rd letter," she said, "that your father built this ranch from nothing. 40 acres and 1 horse and a promise he made to himself." "He did. You said you understood what he meant when he made it, that some things are worth more than what they cost you." "I meant that. I know you did." She was quiet. "That's why I got on the train. Daniel sat beside her in the lamplight and did not say anything for a while. Because some things don't need words, and words can ruin them. Brennan was found at first light, not running. That was the part nobody had anticipated. Pete Alderman, riding the South Ridge in the gray pre-dawn with two of the Vasquez boys, found him sitting against a boulder 2 miles past the south fence, with his coat wrapped around him and the resigned look of a man who had made a calculation in the dark and arrived at an answer he didn't like. He had twisted his ankle badly on the desert rock. He could not have run another mile if he'd wanted to. He looked up at Pete Alderman and said, "Get the sheriff." That was all. Pete got the sheriff. Draper rode out with both deputies and came back with Brennan between them. And the yard of Carter Ridge filled up again with the Vasquez family and the Alderman family, and 4 ranch hands who had slept against the fence and woken up, ready to see how the story ended. Eliza was on the porch when they rode in. Brennan looked at her as they passed. He looked at her with the particular expression of a man trying to work out where his plan had failed, retracing the steps, and she could see the exact moment he arrived at the answer. The moment when the woman who was supposed to be an irrelevant mail-order bride sitting on a bench in Red Hollow had instead walked into a canyon, and every calculation he'd made had unraveled from that point forward. She did not feel satisfaction, exactly. She felt something more precise, the quiet rightness of a thing resolved. She went inside to start coffee. It was the lawyer who broke first, not Brennan. Brennan was a man who had spent years building a defense around himself, and even sitting in Draper's custody in the Carter Ridge front room, with the altered documents laid out on the table before him, he kept his pleasant face and said very little. But his lawyer, a man named Stokes, who had arrived from back east 18 months ago and had evidently not known what kind of business he was walking into, looked at those documents and at the sheriff and at the faces of the 11 people standing in and around that room, and began talking before Draper had finished asking the first question. Stokes talked for an hour and a half. He talked about Judge Harmon and the money that had changed hands over a poker table in a back room of the Red Hollow Hotel. He talked about the 2 hired men who had followed Daniel into Iron Canyon with specific instructions that they would be paid double if Carter Ridge went on the market within the month. He talked about the railroad agent in Santa Fe who had been promised 10% of the sale if Brennan acquired the property. He talked about the 2 smaller ranchers, names Eliza didn't know, who had sold under threats that Stokes himself had delivered without understanding until too late that they were not legal negotiations, but extortion. Draper wrote it all down. Brennan sat across the table with his pleasant face finally gone, replaced by the flat, stripped expression of a man watching everything he'd built fall in a direction he couldn't stop. He looked at Daniel once, near the end. "You should have sold," he said. Not angry, just stating it. 2 years ago, when I first approached you, I offered a fair price. It wasn't yours to buy, Daniel said. It's land, Carter. Land doesn't care who owns it. Then you won't mind losing it, Daniel said. Brennan looked away. Draper closed his notebook and stood. Holt Brennan, I am placing you under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, fraud against a county officer, extortion, and illegal seizure of private property. Mr. Stokes, given your cooperation this morning, I'd advise you to remain available and say nothing further to anyone until you've had time to consult counsel. He looked around the room. The judge from the county seat will be in Red Hollow by the end of the week. Until then, I'll need written statements from everyone present. He looked at Eliza last. Mrs. Carter, he said, your testimony regarding the ambush in Iron Canyon is the foundation of the murder charge. You understand what that means in terms of a formal hearing. I understand, Eliza said. I'll be there. Draper nodded. I thought you would be. They took Brennan away at 9:30. The yard cleared slowly after that. The Vasquez family heading home to check their cattle, the Alderman boys shaking hands with the Carter Ranch hands in the particular way of men who had shared a hard night and come out the other side of it. Miguel Vasquez stopping at the porch to tip his hat to Eliza with the solemn gravity of a man paying a debt. "My family owes you," he said. "Your family stood beside us last night," Eliza said. "That's what neighbors do." Miguel looked at her for a long moment. He looked like a man who had grown accustomed to a certain kind of world and was reassessing whether it might, in fact, be different than he'd thought. "Yes," he said, "that is what neighbors do." He glanced at Daniel, who was standing in the doorway. "You have a good one, Carter." He rode out. Roy Briggs came to the porch last. He stood with his hat in his hands, in the way of a man with something to say that he hadn't figured out yet how to start. "The south fence took some damage last night," he said. "Grass fire got close to the posts before the boys got it out. We'll need to restring about 40 yards. "See to it," Daniel said. "Already started." Roy turned his hat in his hands once. "Jimmy Crane came to me this morning. Boy's been sick with himself since yesterday. He knows opening that gate was wrong, whether he was fooled or not." "What do you think?" Daniel asked. Roy was quiet. "I think he's 19, and Brennan's lawyer was convincing, and Jimmy's not a bad boy who did a bad thing, so much as a young boy who did a foolish one." He paused. "But that's your call." Daniel looked at Eliza. She looked back at him with the expression she'd been wearing since the canyon, the one that said she had an opinion and was waiting to see if he was going to ask for it. "What would you do?" he said. "I'd talk to him," she said. "Not to punish him, to make sure he understands what was at stake and why being convinced by fast talking isn't the same as being absolved of the consequences." She paused. "And then I'd keep him. A young man who has made one bad mistake and knows it is more useful than one who has never been tested." Roy made a small sound that was not quite a laugh. "Your wife thinks like a foreman," he said to Daniel. "She thinks like herself," Daniel said, "which is better." Roy put his hat back on. He looked at Eliza with the direct, weathered look of a man who did not offer opinions he hadn't earned the right to give. "You came a long way, ma'am," he said. "Glad you didn't turn back." He walked to the stable. The ranch went quiet in the particular way it went quiet when the crisis was done and the ordinary work was resuming. The sounds of fence repair and cattle moving and horses being tended. The creak and breath of a working property finding its rhythm again. Daniel stood on the porch with his splinted leg and looked out at all of it. Eliza came and stood beside him with 2 cups of coffee and handed him one without asking whether he wanted it, which he did. They stood and drank coffee in the morning. "I owe you an apology," he said. "You've apologized?" "Not properly. Not for all of it." He turned to look at her. "I put you in danger. By writing those letters, by arranging for you to come out here without telling you the situation. If Brennan had known you existed, if he'd known who you were before you reached the ranch—" "But he didn't," Eliza said. "He could have." "He could have," she agreed. "And I could have decided not to come. And I could have decided to stay on that platform in Red Hollow and wait for someone to come get me instead of walking into the canyon." She looked at him steadily. "I make my own choices, Daniel. I don't need you to protect me from your decisions by taking responsibility for mine." He looked at her for a long time. The morning light was clear and hard and honest. The kind of light that shows people as they are, rather than how a person might want them to be. He thought he had never in his life been looked at the way she looked at him. Not with admiration, not with a careful evaluation of someone deciding whether he was worth trusting, but with the level, clear regard of a person who had already made up their mind and was simply present. "I don't know how to do this," he said. "Do what?" "This." He gestured vaguely between them, which was an imprecise gesture for a precise man, but she seemed to understand it. "I know how to run a ranch. I know how to manage a legal dispute, and read a fraudulent document, and organize a defensive line. I don't know how to—" He stopped. "Be honest about something that isn't a business transaction?" she offered. "Yes," he said. "That." Eliza looked at her coffee cup for a moment. "My mother's advice on that subject," she said, "was to say the true thing, even when it feels premature. Because the cost of saying it too early is embarrassment, and the cost of saying it too late is the thing itself." He was quiet. "So," she said, "say it." Daniel Carter stood on his own porch in the morning light with a broken leg and a coffee cup, and looked at the woman who had found him under the rocks, and said the true thing. "I don't want you to leave," he said. "Not because I need a legal partner, or because of the railroad dispute, or because of anything tactical or strategic. I want you to stay because in 2 days, you have become the person I most want to talk to. And I have spent 8 years building this ranch, and I have never once looked at it and thought, I want someone to see this with me. Until now." Eliza said nothing for a long moment. 2 days is a very short time," she said. "I know. We have 10 pages of letters and 2 days of crisis. That is not a complete picture of a person." "I know that too. You could turn out to be entirely different when things are ordinary." "So could you," he said. She looked at him. "That's fair," she said. "I'm not asking you to decide anything today," he said. "I'm asking you, the same way I asked in the letter, except now I'm asking it honestly in person, and you know the full situation. If you're willing to stay and find out." The sounds of the ranch moved around them. Somewhere down the fence line, Roy Briggs was giving instructions to the men restringing the wire. A horse called from the stable. The coffee was going cold. Eliza held her cup in both hands and looked out at the land, at the open sky and the distant ridge and the wide, difficult, honest country that she had walked into with a suitcase and a letter and no horse, and that had handed her, in 2 days, more life than she had expected to find in a year. "I'll stay through the hearing," she said. "The sheriff needs my testimony." "Yes," Daniel said. "And after the hearing, we'll talk again." "Yes." She looked at him sideways. "And you're going to let me look at the ranch accounts? Because I have a strong suspicion that your east pasture leases have been undervalued for at least 3 years, and someone has been taking advantage of that." Daniel stared at her. "How do you—" "Miguel Vasquez mentioned it when we were talking last night. He said your east fence rate was half what his own lease was running." She raised an eyebrow. "I was listening." He looked at her for a moment with an expression that had moved entirely past anything he'd planned to feel. "You are remarkable," he said. "I'm practical," she said. "It's not the same thing." But something moved at the corner of her mouth. Not quite a smile. Close enough. The afternoon brought the thing nobody had anticipated. Stokes, the lawyer, came back. He came alone, without a horse, which meant he'd walked the 4 miles from town, which meant it was something he hadn't wanted anyone to see him doing. Roy stopped him at the gate and sent word to the house, and Daniel came out to meet him, with Roy at his shoulder and the particular expression of a man who had not finished being surprised by this day. Stokes was sweating. He was a slight man, in his early 40s, who looked like he'd aged several years since the morning. and he held his hat in both hands in the way of someone who has shed the professional armor and isn't comfortable without it. "I need to speak to Mrs. Carter," he said. Roy looked at Daniel. Daniel looked at Stokes. "Why?" Daniel said. Stokes looked at the ground. "Because what I'm about to tell you concerns her specifically, and I think she has a right to hear it from me directly, rather than from the sheriff's office." He paused. "It's about the letters, the original correspondence, between Brennan and others." "What others?" Daniel said. Stokes looked up. "The agency," he said. "The correspondence agency in Kansas City. The one that arranged the introduction." The yard went very quiet. Eliza had come to the door while they were talking. She stood in the doorway with the stillness of someone who had heard the words Kansas City and understood that whatever came next was going to require everything she had. "What about it?" she said. Stokes turned to her. He looked at her with the expression of a man paying a debt he hadn't chosen to take on, but had inherited by association. And he said the thing that changed the shape of the story again. "Brennan had a contact inside the agency," he said. "A clerk who passed him information about new correspondence, about clients. When your file was opened, when you responded to Mr. Carter's advertisement, the clerk informed Brennan." He stopped, swallowed. "Brennan knew about you before Mr. Carter did. He knew there was a woman coming from Kansas City, and he knew when, and he knew the train." The silence that followed was absolute. Eliza looked at Stokes steadily. Her face had not changed, but her hand had found the doorframe without her appearing to notice. "He tried to use that," she said. "It wasn't a question." There were instructions," Stokes said, "for a man in Red Hollow, before the ambush, before everything went wrong. Instructions that if Mr. Carter survived the canyon, the woman from Kansas City was to be—" He stopped again, looked at the ground. "Discouraged from continuing to the ranch." "Discouraged," Eliza said. "Those were the words in the letter. What it meant in practice—" He shook his head. "I don't know. I want to believe it meant turning her away, sending her back. But given everything else I've seen Brennan authorize—" He didn't finish. He didn't need to. Daniel had gone very still beside Roy. The particular stillness of a man receiving information that his body understood before his mind had finished processing it. The kind of information that reconfigures things, that takes what you thought the shape of something was and shows you it was different all along. The station master. The hesitation when Eliza had said Daniel's name. The look on his face when she said she was Daniel Carter's intended bride. The way he had told her about Iron Canyon. Carefully, gently, not quite discouraging, but not quite not. And then watched her go. Daniel looked at Eliza. She was already looking at him. "He knew," she said quietly. "The station master. He knew I was coming, and he knew about the canyon, and he—" She paused. "He warned me about it. He told me to take the longer road." "He warned you," Daniel said. "Not directly, but he told me." Her voice was very even. The kind of even that means a person is working hard to keep it that way. "He knew what was in that canyon, and he told me to go the long way around." "He went against Brennan," Daniel said. "He went against Brennan," she said, "and I didn't listen." They looked at each other across the porch. With everything that had happened in the last 2 days between them, the canyon and the fever and the riders on the creek path, and Holt Brennan in the front room, and Roy Briggs turning his hat in his hands, and Miguel Vasquez's daughter laughing in the lamplight. And underneath all of it, this thing that had been there from the beginning, that the woman no one had come for had been exactly where someone wanted her to be, and had survived it not because she'd been kept safe, but because she'd been unstoppable. "What do you need from me?" Stokes said. "Formally. For the sheriff. I'll testify to everything I just told you." "You'll write it down," Eliza said. "Every name, every instruction. The clerk at the agency and the man in Red Hollow, and exactly what Brennan intended." Her voice was steady and clear. "And you'll come with me to the sheriff's office tomorrow morning, and you'll repeat it in front of Cal Draper. And if there's a hearing, you'll stand in front of a judge and repeat it there too." "Yes," Stokes said. "And the station master," she said. "Amos Fielding. He warned me about the canyon. Whatever he knew, whatever arrangement he'd been pressured into, that matters. He was a frightened man who chose to do the right thing in the only way he could manage. That matters." "I'll say so," Stokes said. "You'll say so on paper," Eliza said. "On paper," he agreed. She looked at him for a moment more. Then she nodded, once, with the finality of a woman closing a ledger. "Thank you for coming," she said. "Roy will see you back to the road." She went back inside. Roy escorted Stokes out. Daniel stood on the porch alone for a moment, and then he went inside after her. She was at the table with her mother's journal open, writing in the margins the way she'd been doing since the canyon. Notes, dates, names, facts. The careful accounting of a woman who understood that memory was fallible and paper was not. She didn't look up when he came in. "Eliza," he said. "I'm all right," she said. She kept writing. "You don't have to be all right immediately." "I know." She finished the sentence she was writing and set down the pen. She looked at her hands. The cloth wrapping on the cuts from the canyon was gray with use. She'd need to change it. She'd been meaning to since this morning, and kept getting pulled elsewhere. "They were trying to make sure I never reached you," she said. "Yes." "And if I had taken the road instead of the canyon, you would have arrived safely," he said. "And I would have been dead." She looked at that for a moment. All of its implications. The canyon and the rocks, and the blood on the stirrup, and the thin thread of a pulse she'd found under her fingers. "It's strange," she said. "The thing that was meant to harm us is the reason we're here." "I've been thinking about that," he said. She looked at him. "I've been thinking," he said carefully, "that I spent a long time being strategic about everything in my life because the ranch required it. Every decision justified by its purpose. Every relationship measured by its use." He sat down across from her. "And then a woman who was supposed to arrive by the safe road took the canyon path instead. And the most important thing that has ever happened to me happened because neither of us was where we were supposed to be." Eliza was quiet. "I'm still not asking you to decide anything," he said. "I meant what I said about the hearing and talking again after." "I know you did," she said. "I just wanted you to know that what Stokes said today doesn't change anything from my side. You were in danger because of my enemies, and you survived it because of who you are. And whatever you decide about staying or leaving, that's the truth, and it doesn't have conditions on it." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she reached across the table and held out her wrapped hand. Not reaching for him exactly, just placing it there. An offering. A small, deliberate act of a woman who made her choices carefully and without ambiguity. He looked at her hand. Then he covered it with his. They sat like that at the table while the afternoon light shifted, while the sounds of the ranch moved around them, while the day settled toward evening. Outside, Roy Briggs walked past the window, looked in, and kept walking without breaking his stride. The south fence was almost repaired. The grass fire was out. Brennan was in custody. The documents were in the sheriff's office, and in the front room of Carter Ridge Ranch, the woman who had come all the way from Kansas City on the word of a man she'd never met was sitting across a table from that man, her injured hand in his, both of them quiet in the easy way of people who have already said the important things and don't need to fill the silence. Somewhere on the desk behind them, under the lamp, a folded letter waited, its creases soft as cloth from being read too many times, its words already outpaced by everything that had happened since. I look forward to beginning our new arrangement with sincerity and respect. He had meant that when he wrote it. He understood now that he hadn't known what he was actually writing toward. The hearing was set for Thursday. That gave them 4 days. 4 days in which Carter Ridge Ranch resumed the rhythms of a working property. Fence repairs and cattle counts, and the ordinary accountable business of land that had been fought for and held. 4 days, and Eliza Whitmore moved through those rhythms with the quiet efficiency of someone who had never needed to be invited twice into a place where there was work to be done. She found the East Pasture lease discrepancy on the first morning. 3 years of undervalued rates on 40 acres, exactly as she'd told Daniel she suspected. The numbers sitting in the ledger with the patient wrongness of a thing nobody had looked at hard enough. She put the corrected figures on the desk without ceremony. Daniel found them when he sat down after breakfast and looked at them for a long time, and then looked at Eliza, who was already on to the next ledger. "How long did this take you?" he said. 2 hours, she said. "Your bookkeeping is thorough. It just needed someone to read it from outside." Roy Briggs, passing the doorway with a saddle over one arm, slowed down just long enough to catch Daniel's eye and raise one deliberate eyebrow before continuing on his way. On the second day, Amos Fielding came to the ranch. He came in the early afternoon, riding slowly, and he tied his horse at the gate and stood there for a moment as if deciding whether he was going to keep walking or turn back. Roy saw him from the stable and sent word to the house, and it was Eliza who came to the gate to meet him, not Daniel. Fielding looked older than he had at the station. The particular aging that happens to a person in a short time when they've been carrying something they know they should have set down sooner. "Mrs. Carter," he said. He had heard the name then. Red Hollow was a small county. "Mr. Fielding," she said. He turned his hat in his hands. "I came to apologize," he said, "for what I didn't say at the station. I knew those men had been through. I knew what they were planning, or close enough to it. I knew what was in that canyon." He stopped. "I was afraid. That's the whole of it. I was afraid, and I told myself the hint about the road was enough, and I knew it wasn't." Eliza looked at him. "You did tell me," she said. "Not clearly enough." "No," she agreed. "Not clearly enough. But you told me." She paused. "I chose the canyon anyway. That was my decision, not yours." "Still," he said. "Still," she agreed. "Are you willing to testify at the hearing about what you saw and what you were told?" "That's why I came." He looked at her steadily for the first time. "Stokes came to see me yesterday. He told me what he told you." A pause. "I'm glad you're alive, ma'am. I'm glad you didn't take the long road." Eliza was quiet for a moment. She thought about the canyon. She thought about a man under the rocks with a pulse thin as a thread, and the particular quality of stillness that meant a person was still deciding whether to stay. "So am I," she said. "Come inside. I'll get you coffee, and you can tell me exactly what you're prepared to say in front of the judge." Daniel watched from the porch as she walked Amos Fielding to the door. Roy came and stood beside him without being asked, which was something Roy did when he had something to say and was deciding how to say it. "She's going to run this county in 10 years, Roy said. "She's going to run this ranch in 10 months, Daniel said. Roy made the sound that was almost a laugh. "Does she know that?" "I think she's already started and is being polite about it." Roy nodded. He looked at the gate, the repaired south fence, the cattle visible on the far pasture. "She asked me this morning about the water rights on the North Creek," he said. whether we'd filed the correct claim after the Harmon family moved out. Daniel turned to look at him. Had we? No, Roy said. We had not. He paused. She found it in the land office record she'd borrowed from Draper. Another pause. I filed it this afternoon. Daniel turned back to the door, where Eliza had just disappeared with Amos Fielding. Roy, he said. Boss? When the hearing is finished, Daniel said, I'm going to ask her to marry me. Properly. Not as strategy, not as legal cover. Actually ask her, the right way, with the full understanding that she'll tell me exactly what she thinks of the question, and may very possibly say no, or tell me it's too soon, or outline a set of conditions I'll need to agree to in advance. Roy was quiet for a moment. Sounds about right, he said. I wanted you to know. I appreciate that. Roy started back toward the stable. He stopped after 3 steps. She won't say no, he said, without turning around. But she'll definitely have conditions. He kept walking. The night before the hearing, Eliza couldn't sleep. She knew it wasn't fear, not of the hearing itself, not of the testimony, not of standing in front of a judge and saying clearly and precisely what she had seen in Iron Canyon. She had been preparing for that since the first morning, and she knew exactly what she was going to say and in what order. It was something else keeping her awake. The kind of sleeplessness that comes when a person is standing at the edge of a change they've chosen and can see both sides of it clearly, what lies ahead and what lies behind, and their mind won't stop walking the line between them. She went to the kitchen. Daniel was already there. He was sitting at the table with a cup of coffee that had gone cold, his splinted leg out straight, a piece of paper in front of him that he turned face down when she came in, which told her immediately what it was. You're writing a letter, she said. I was trying to, he said. It wasn't going well. She got herself a cup and sat across from him. Who to? He looked at her steadily. You, he said. She looked at the face-down paper. I couldn't say it out loud without planning it first, he said. That's a character flaw. I'm aware of it. It's not a flaw, she said. You're a careful man. You say things when you know what you mean. I know what I mean, he said. I just can't find the arrangement of words that does it justice. She was quiet. Then say it without the right words, she said. I'm a practical woman. I can work with an approximation. He looked at her for a long moment, across the kitchen table, 2 people with cold coffee and the night around them, and 4 days of everything between them. And he said it, without the right words, plainly and directly, the way she had asked him to. I want you to stay, he said. Not through the hearing, not through the summer. I want you to stay because this ranch is the thing my father built, and I have spent 8 years fighting to keep it. And I have never once in those 8 years shown it to someone and felt what I feel when I watch you walk through it. He paused. I want you to stay because you read ledgers at dawn and argue water rights with my foreman and told Holt Brennan to his face what he was without your voice shaking once. I want you to stay because every letter you ever wrote me was honest, even when honesty was inconvenient, and I have not had enough of that in my life. He stopped. Then, I want to marry you, if you'll have me. Knowing everything now, the land dispute, and the enemies, and the ranch, and the letters, and the canyon, and all of it. I'm asking you honestly, and I'll accept whatever answer you give. The kitchen was very quiet. Eliza held her cold cup in both hands and looked at the man across the table and thought about a letter she had read so many times the folds had gone soft as cloth. She thought about standing on a platform with a suitcase and no one coming, and making the decision to walk anyway. She thought about a pulse under her fingers in the dark, and the long night of counting breaths, and the feeling that had been with her through all of it. Not fear, not heroism. Just the plain insistence of a woman who had always believed that if you were the one standing there, you were the one who had to act. She set down her cup. "You have 3 conditions," she said. He blinked. Then something moved in his face that was, unmistakably, the beginning of a real smile. "Tell me." "The East pasture leases get corrected to market rate this month, not next quarter." "Done." "I have full standing on the property accounts, not advisory, actual standing." "Done." She paused. "And third," he said. "The creek cabin," she said. "The one where I kept you alive for 3 days. I want it repaired properly, not as a storage outbuilding, as a place." He looked at her. "It's where I decided to stay," she said. "The first night, when I sat in the dark and listened to your breathing, and the horses were on the ridge, and I didn't leave." She paused. "I want to keep it." Daniel Carter looked at Eliza Whitmore across the kitchen table in the middle of the night, and whatever he had expected the third condition to be, it had not been that. Something in him moved in the way things move when they've found the place they were always supposed to be. "Done," he said. His voice had gone quieter than before. She nodded once, with the finality of a woman who has settled an important matter. Then she said, "Yes." "Yes," he repeated. "That's my answer," she said. "Yes." The hearing lasted most of Thursday. Stokes testified for 2 hours. His account was precise and damning. The judge's name, the amounts, the dates, the specific instructions regarding Daniel Carter's death, and the subsequent removal of his intended bride from the county. The courtroom in Red Hollow was standing room and then some. People spilling out the door into the street. The whole small county turning out because in a place this size, when the biggest story anyone could remember is finally being told in public, nobody stays home. Amos Fielding testified for 40 minutes. He was a thin, careful man who had spent 12 years watching people pass through a station, and had finally been asked to say plainly what he'd seen. He said it. Every word. Including the instructions he'd been given, the money he'd been offered, and the reason he had instead told a woman from Kansas City to take the long road, and hoped that would be enough. When they asked him why he'd warned her, he said, "Because she looked like a woman who had come a long way for a decent reason, and I had enough left in me to not want to be the one who kept her from it." There was a silence in the courtroom after that. Miguel Vasquez testified about 3 years of fraudulent grazing claims and a bull driven off his land on false legal grounds. Tom Alderman testified about a water rights document that had been forged with his signature. 2 hands from Brennan's own operation testified, quietly, carefully, with the look of men stepping off a sinking structure while there was still time, about orders they had been given and what those orders had amounted to. And then the judge called Eliza Carter. She walked to the front of that courtroom in the only decent dress she still had, the spare one from the wrecked suitcase, brushed clean and pressed with a flat iron she'd found in the kitchen. And she stood before the judge, and she told the story. She told it plainly, without embellishment, without drama, in the clear, exact voice of a woman who had been trained since childhood to describe what she saw and what she did and what she knew to be true. She told it from the moment she left the station to the moment Draper had ridden out with Brennan between his deputies, and she did not leave anything out. The courtroom was silent the entire time she spoke. When she finished, the judge looked at her for a long moment. He was an older man, heavy through the shoulders, with the face of someone who had sat on a bench for 20 years and heard most of what human beings were capable of, good and otherwise. "Mrs. Carter," he said, "you walked into Iron Canyon alone, on foot, with no knowledge of the territory, and rendered medical aid to an ambush victim. transported him to shelter, treated his injuries, and protected him through the night?" "Yes, sir," she said. "And the following morning, you obtained the fraudulent documents, confronted the man responsible, provided tactical support during a nighttime defensive action, and directed a civilian witness to come forward to law enforcement?" Eliza paused. "I would say the events unfolded with contributions from many people. But you were at the center of most of them." She looked at the judge. "I was where I was needed," she said. He looked at her for another moment. Then he said simply, "Thank you for your testimony, Mrs. Carter." She walked back to her seat. Daniel was watching her from the row behind the bar. He had been watching her the entire time she spoke, with the expression of a man who had thought he understood what he was looking at, and kept discovering new depth. She sat down beside him and looked straight ahead. He leaned slightly toward her. "Tactical support," he said quietly. "Smoke packets are a legitimate tactical tool," she said. He pressed his lips together, not smiling, very nearly smiling. The verdict came down at 4:30. Holt Brennan was found guilty on all charges: conspiracy to commit murder, fraud against a county officer, extortion, illegal seizure of private property. The judge added a charge of criminal intimidation against the smaller landowners that Brennan's lawyer tried to argue and failed. The sentence was delivered in the level, factual tone of a man who had no patience left for people who used legal instruments as weapons against those who couldn't afford to fight back. Brennan stood and received it with the flat face of a man who had already accepted the loss on the long walk in from the desert. He did not look at Daniel. He looked once at Eliza, briefly, with the expression of someone filing a final calculation. And then he looked at the floor. His lawyer asked for time to consider an appeal. The judge said he could have all the time he needed, and that the sentence would begin regardless. The courtroom erupted, not with celebration exactly, not the loud, undignified noise of people who had been waiting for someone to fall. It was more like the sound a room makes when it releases a long breath, when the weight of something that has been pressing down lifts, and people remember what the air felt like before it was there. Miguel Vasquez shook Daniel's hand and then turned and shook Eliza's. Tom Alderman said, 3 years I've been waiting on this, and then had to stop talking for a moment. Roy Briggs, who had ridden into town for the hearing and stationed himself at the back of the courtroom with his arms crossed and his hat pulled low, caught Eliza's eye across the crowd and gave her a single, deliberate nod. She nodded back. They rode back to the ranch in the long evening light, the hearing behind them and the road ahead, and for the first mile or so, neither of them said anything at all. There was nothing that needed saying immediately. Some things are complete in themselves and don't require commentary. Then Eliza said, "The East Pasture leases." Daniel almost laughed. A real one, the kind that came from somewhere genuine. "Today?" he said. "You want to talk about the leases today?" "Tomorrow," she said. "I just want you to have it in mind." "It's in mind," he said. "It's always going to be in mind." She looked at him sideways. The evening light was doing something to the country around them, making the hills go gold and the shadows go long, and the whole thing look, for a moment, like a painting of the West rather than the real thing. But it was real. All of it was real. "I wrote back to that letter," she said, "because it was the most honest thing I had ever read from a man I didn't know. It said exactly what it was. An arrangement, a partnership, a practical thing between two people who wanted a decent life." She paused. "Most men who advertise for a wife write about what they're offering. You wrote about what you needed." Daniel was quiet. "You said you needed someone who understood that a partnership requires honesty more than it requires sentiment," she said. I had read that sentence 10 times before I sat down to answer it, because it was the first time I had seen the thing I believed about the world written down by someone else. "I meant it," he said. "I know." She looked forward at the road. And then I read the rest of the letters, and the sentiment was there too, just underneath, the way water runs under rock. You couldn't quite keep it out. He rode beside her in the evening and said nothing. "That's the part that got me on the train," she said. "The sentiment under the rock." He looked at her. She looked back at him with those steady eyes that had been reading him clearly since the first moment he'd opened his own in a canyon and found her kneeling beside him, with her hands bleeding and her voice level and her mind already 3 steps ahead of the immediate problem. "I want you to know that," she said. "So there's nothing unsaid." "There's nothing unsaid," he agreed. They turned in through the Carter Ridge gate as the last of the evening light fell across the ranch. The repaired fence, the settled cattle, the lamplight already showing in the bunkhouse windows where the men were finishing supper. Roy's horse was tied at the stable, which meant he'd beaten them back. The creek cabin sat a quarter-mile east, waiting for the repairs she'd asked for, and would oversee herself when the week's work allowed. Eliza pulled up at the porch step and dismounted with the easy confidence of a woman who had been doing things for the first time her whole life, and had learned that competence followed willingness the way water followed slope. She looked up at the house, her father-in-law's house, the house that had been built from 40 acres and 1 horse and a promise, the house that had been fought for and held and was now, as of this week, fully and legally and permanently belonging to the people who deserved it. Daniel came up beside her. "Welcome home," he said. She looked at him. She looked at the ranch around her. She thought about a platform in Red Hollow with no one on it, and a suitcase, and a letter, and a decision made in the particular quiet of a woman who had run out of reasons to wait for someone else to act. She thought about all the ways this had almost not happened. The road not taken, the rocks in the canyon, the long, dark night of a fever that had nearly won, the riders on the ridge, and the smoke packets, and Holt Brennan's flat eyes in a courtroom. She thought about Amos Fielding, who had told her to take the long road and hoped it would be enough, and how it hadn't been, and how that had saved everything. "Home," she said, not trying the word, not borrowing it, saying it the way a person says a thing they have decided is true and intend to keep being true for as long as they have breath to say it. She took the first step up to the porch. Behind her, Daniel Carter, rancher, letter writer, man who had been found under rocks and given back the life he'd nearly lost, followed her up the steps of the house his father had built, on the land he had fought for and kept, beside the woman who had carried him through the dark without asking who he was. The forgotten mail-order bride who had walked into a canyon with a worn suitcase and her mother's journal and nothing else. She had come to New Mexico looking for a decent life and an honest partnership with a stranger. What she found was a man worth carrying, a fight worth winning, and a home she had earned with her own 2 bleeding hands. And that is exactly where she stayed.